Everybody, welcome. I see we've reached quite a respectable number, so let's get started. This is Digital Salon, our first episode, which is Beethoven Now. I'm Dean Whiteside, and this is coming to you live from the Goethe-Institut New York, bringing to you what we do, our director, Jörg Schumacher, and this is really an experiment. Yeah, an experiment to bring together leading thinkers, artists, intellectuals from a wide variety of cultural disciplines. And it's really about you, this global audience as well, to bring you into conversation with these remarkable people. So we're going to want you to speak today. I'll explain that a little bit more as we continue. I should say the Goethe-Institut New York is usually at 30 Irving Place. This is just near Union Square in Lower Manhattan. And we're one of 159 Goethe Institutes worldwide with our mission to promote knowledge of German culture and language abroad, and also to portray the rich and vibrant cultural life of contemporary Germany. So you may be wondering, contemporary Germany, why we're devoting this first episode to the guy on my t-shirt right here, Mr. Ludwig van, who is not exactly contemporary. In fact, he's turning 250 this December. Before this pandemic broke out, we were just inundated with performances of Beethoven, one after the other, probably where you are as well, wherever you're watching. And I was happy to see people registering from Germany, Austria, France, Brazil. So really a global crowd today. I'm sure it was the same with you. Then after this all happened, there was silence. And rather than playing lots of Beethoven or trying to do some kind of house concert, we thought we could fill this space and take a moment to pause and think about Beethoven and to think about what he means today and what he means to three wonderful, vibrant thinkers and practitioners who have engaged with him in different ways. Yeah? So we have a conductor, a composer, a philosopher. I'll introduce them to you in just a minute. And I was thinking, we suffer in a way from an over proximity to Beethoven, it seems, that we all know how these tunes and motives go, and ba 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 on the fifth, of the famous Ode to Joy, An die Freude from the Ninth Symphony, and they start to sound like quotations. And I think that actually makes it difficult to have some kind of authentic experience of Beethoven's music and to really understand him. That might stand in the way, is the thought, this over proximity. So fortunately today, we have three wonderful thinkers who have devoted themselves in different ways to precisely understanding Beethoven at a deeper level. I'd like to introduce them to you now. They're not only brilliant thinking musicians and musical thinkers, but also warm-hearted souls who have a real humanistic perspective to what they do. They are Erina Yashima, a German conductor who grew up in Hanover and is currently the assistant conductor at the Philadelphia Orchestra. Then Lydia Goehr, who is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Columbia University here in New York. And finally, Michael Alec Rose, who is a wonderful contemporary composer and teaches at the Blair School of Music at Vanderbilt University. Thank you very much for joining us today. Where are you? How are you doing? And tell us a little bit about your relationship to Beethoven.
I start this conversation. I'm currently in Philadelphia at home, and we're still locked down. We did our last concert with Beethoven, actually. I was assisting Yannick Nézet-Séguin, our music director, and the last concert we played was on March 12th. And it was one of those moments I will always look back, and one of those artistic moments where I say, I I was there when that happened. There was a really extraordinary concert because exactly what you said, Dean. It's such standard repertoire, Beethoven. We know, especially the musicians in the Philadelphia Orchestra, they have played it so many times. They know it inside out. Yet, because of the tension of the health crisis, the situation, also with the question when we get to stage again, that was really an extraordinary performance. So that was the last time I heard Beethoven.
Great.
My turn. Thank you, Dean, for hosting this and for inviting me. My first memory of Beethoven really was when I was about 11. I think my cousin Rebecca is here. Hi, Becky. It was at your house, and we were there for a barbecue. But one of your parents, Aunt Ev or Uncle Mort, had put on the recording of the Beethoven Violin Concerto, but with Yehudi Menuhin. And I went upstairs to the bathroom, but it was playing in one of the rooms upstairs, and I forgot about going to the bathroom because I just had to sit down on the bed and listen to that recording. And I just started weeping because of what I was listening to. I could not believe that anything like this was possible. And, I went on, yes, I have taught a course. At least my students who are listening now know that I've taught a course called Beethoven and the Beatles. That was fun. And I actually do a lecture from that course for an organization called One Day University. And I wrote a book about the Beatles and Beethoven, at least 2 chapters of that book. And I've taken Vanderbilt alumni trips to Beethoven's house in Heiligenstadt, played the piano in that room. And I'm writing another book now comparing Beethoven to Goya, first chapter at least. I have no idea if it's going to work, but Beethoven's at the center of my own life as a composer and as a teacher, and I'm really grateful to have this chance to reflect about what he means to me. Thanks.
So, hi everybody. I suppose I'm lucky that I sort of made my career on one question. Why does everybody talk about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony whenever they think about the philosophy of music? And by the time I'd given an answer to that question, my life seemed set out for me. But I think I'd like to just note something that makes me rather shaky inside regarding this issue of proximity and familiarity. I did 2 Beethoven gigs last year in California with the Camerata Pacifica, and one of the dominant themes of the conversation on the panel was how people were so familiar with Beethoven now that they've lost the capacity to listen. They know exactly what they're going to get, and mostly they get it, and it's kind of unsatisfying because they're so used to it. And so we decided that Beethoven and the concert hall in its entirety should be cancelled for 10 years. And little did we know that somehow we were predicting at least a small amount of our future. So I feel a little strange about this now. But we could talk a lot about the proximity and the quotation effect of Beethoven. I've thought a lot about that. But mostly I've thought about the enormous contribution of less Beethoven as a musician and composer, but everything that Beethoven came to stand for in redefining what musical practice was about, in thinking about the duration of what a musical work would be. It gives a standard to the length of the CD, etc., etc. So this kind of social history around Beethoven. So that's been my life's work, I suppose.
Great. And the way you mentioned, Lydia, about how the social history was so influenced by Beethoven's music, seems that for each of your disciplines, Beethoven also had a pivotal role in the formation of what these disciplines are. Certainly as a composer, he's almost the archetype of what a composer is, right? As a an almost godlike creative force who creates these autonomous works through the power of his genius, right? But if we remember that in Beethoven's time, of course, there was not yet this separation between composers and conductors. And the conductor emerges a bit later in history as a very interesting figure who does not create works herself, but rather reproduces artworks, musical works, which others have written.
But always gets paid much more.
Yes, exactly. Also an interesting question. But and the conductor, of course, who has a very unique perspective of understanding the musical work as an object which is made, right? As something to get under the hood, to understand the different parts which comprise the musical score in all its grandeur and complexity, yeah? The melody, the harmony, the counterpoint, the rhythm, and then to figure out how those elements are all connected and to synthesize them through an imaginative form of ideal hearing of how it should sound. And of course, finally, to convey that understanding through one's body to the musician. So it's quite a complex process. And of course, philosophy, Lydia can speak to and has written wonderfully in her books. I'll share some of them as well as Michael's to you about how Beethoven influenced history, right? And through the history of German philosophy and the German intellectual tradition, the arts have a very important role, especially music, yeah? Due to their specific place within German society, German cultural practices. They're not merely entertainment, as perhaps in some other cultures, but they are viewed as articulating something about how the essence of things really are, right? In different ways.
I think it's very important that not to speak of sort of Beethoven doing this, but Beethoven in quotation marks.
Exactly.
It's the construction of a myth around Beethoven that is partly formed in his time through the beginnings of the so-called philosophy of music. This using Beethoven as a name to represent a way of thinking about music.
Exactly.
So, and the interesting thing is that the actual life and works and compositions of Beethoven somewhat contradict the mythic construction that we've made. So there's Beethoven and there's Beethoven.
Right, and one of the things which, one of the things that Lydia has done so well is to ask, where does the question of the meaning of a work reside? Is it within the works? Is it within the score? Is it within how it sounds? Or is it related to questions of its connection to culture, to history? And if we think in those lines, the picture becomes quite complex about Beethoven. A good friend of mine, a former New York City history teacher, wrote to me last week reminding me of the use of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony at a birthday celebration for Hitler in Berlin in 1942. And I would add to this checkered past, other uses like in the early 1970s with the establishment of the European Union, the use of the Ode to Joy from the Ninth Symphony as the official EU hymn. To add to that, the famous performance in 1989 at the fall of the Berlin Wall with Bernstein, in which the word Freude from Schiller's text was changed to Freiheit, very famously. And then finally in 2000, I remember, old enough to remember this very controversial performance on the grounds of the former Mauthausen concentration camp to commemorate the 55th anniversary of the Befreiung. And in a moment of historical irony was, of course, the Vienna Philharmonic, which played at this event. And how does one make sense of that? That to me is very baffling and seems like a question philosophy might be able to answer. So we should get moving. We're just at 1:15. The way this is going to work is we'll divide the next 45 minutes into three parts in which Erina, Michael, and then Lydia will each get 15 minutes in a way to steer the ship and to direct this conversation. But it's important that we engage you and that you ask questions. So if dear audience, you'll just look at the bottom of your screen, on the left-hand side, you'll see something that says Q&A, or F und A if your Zoom is auf Deutsch. Just click on that and write a question, please. Write a question that pops into your mind over this conversation. And what I will do then is unmute you. So we have the capacity to do that. We'll unmute you and you'll be able to speak. And we'll confirm that. I can respond to your question and just make sure everything's okay. I can read the question for you if you prefer, but it's better, of course, to hear your voices. So, los geht's, Erina.
Thank you for the introduction, and you pointed out a couple of very interesting things. I wanted to add an anecdote to Lydia's remark that because of the proximity of Beethoven in our canon of classical music, we should ban it for 10 years to have the freshness and the surprise and the revolutionary spirit again when we listen to Beethoven. And that reminds me of a story Riccardo Muti told me when I was with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. I was the apprentice conductor, and he told a very interesting story that La Traviata by Verdi has also this proximity, especially for the Italian culture. And when he was music director at the Scala in Milano, they didn't perform La Traviata for over 20 years. Over 20 years. I mean, that is insane for such an popular piece. And when he then decided as music director to bring it back to the Scala, first of all, there were a lot of, people who were opposing to that idea, and he would get death threats and all kind of stuff. But when he started the first rehearsal with the strings playing the prelude to Traviata, he said how the musicians had tears in their eyes because they brought home that music that means so much to them again. So that reminded me of the importance of culture and clearing one's ears from the routine. I mean, Nikolaus Anoncourt, who has profoundly formed how we perform Beethoven with his historical performance practice. He said the biggest danger for a musician is routine, that you get used to what is extraordinary. But to go back to our conversation, Dean asked me to play a little example of my work. So I was searching through my video archives and found a recording with the Civic Orchestra of Chicago. This is a small excerpt from Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, the last part from the finale. I hope this works. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let's try this. Does it work? Okay. Am I back on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, yeah, I talked with Dean yesterday, and she said, "Yeah, that's a typical Beethoven example." And I thought, yes and no. It is typical Beethoven in the way that he just fools you around with all the surprises and expectations, especially. But on the other hand, the Fourth Symphony is most famously between Eroica and then the Fifth Symphony, two giants, and also it is astonishingly light-hearted and joyful. Now, when I think Beethoven is joyful, for me, there's always this connotation of it is just temporary, or it is something behind, or it is in an idealistic way, like the ode to joy. It is not only the pure joy at the moment itself, but it is also the hope, and it's also his idealism of mankind, humanity. That is what I always associate when I listen to Beethoven. Also, this moment, this temporary, this precious thing that could escape any time. Du bist so, verweile doch, du bist so schön, to quote from Faust, stay because you're so beautiful. But Beethoven was actually always the person who moved forward, who did not exactly like Faust, who did not want to stop, who always surprised us. If you think of his 9 symphonies, how different they are and what each symphony means to the canon of classical music. Now, a few months ago, I did my debut with the Chicago Symphony, and there was a school and family concert, and at the Chicago Symphony, there is this wonderful program director, John Weber, and he curates very, very thoughtfully those education programs. And he gave me this impossible task to put together a program of excerpts of Beethoven's symphonic work, 30 to 35 minutes of actual music to capture the whole landscape. Obviously, that is impossible to do. And also, I was at the beginning, I really tried to not do the commonplaces, to the topos of Beethoven. I was like, can we avoid to do this Beethoven concert without the Ode to Joy and the Fifth Symphony? Is it even possible? And of course, it was absolutely not. We started with the first movement of the Fifth, and we ended with the Ode to Joy. I think this is because of Beethoven's importance through his work. We started out with we had the First Symphony, just to see where he started from, the more Haydn style, and then I think the turning point is the Eroica Symphony in his symphonic work. And even if you see it on the big picture, not only Beethoven's opus, the Eroica Symphony is for me the one that changed music history and that laid down the foundation for 150 years of composing. I don't know if you would agree, Michael. Maybe he's still
more than 150.
Right, still now.
Yes.
Well, we will get to your perspective, which I found very interesting. When the Philadelphia Orchestra programmed the Beethoven cycle for his 25th anniversary, there was we combined it. There was the counterpoint with new commissioned pieces by young composers, and with the idea, what means Beethoven now? So actually, yes, you're right. It is more than the tonal music, let's say. And there are few composers, actually works in the music history, which I think are so much in advance of their time. One of it is for me, Rite of Spring, which just falls out of nothing onto the earth, and you wonder, where did that come from? This is so revolutionary. Pierrot Lunaire is also one of those pieces where I really would like to look into Schoenberg's head to see where this craziness of a piece appeared. Also, Symphonie Fantastique, Berlioz, those are pieces that really are, for me, outstanding and revolutionary. But Beethoven did not only had one of those works, he had so many columns that profoundly changed how we listen to music, how we make music as interpreters, and how composers after him composed music. Obviously, that is the most important point. There are many letters, and there are testimonies who say how Beethoven influenced the lives, Schumann, Brahms, most famously the steps of the big giant Schubert, of course, as well. And I think on the music historical level, that is outstanding. But obviously, it is also Beethoven, as Lydia pointed out before, he was also, the time was ready for Beethoven when he appeared. So he is also a historical figure in that part. And for me, as conductor, Beethoven remains one of the most challenging composers. Actually, the concert I just showed now, after the break, we did Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony, which was broadcasted at WFMT very recently. And I listened to that recording, and I was pretty much, not that I was 100% happy, but I still could say, okay, this is quite close to what I would do today. So the concert was 2 years ago. There was pretty much still my view. Not so with Beethoven, for interestingly. So when I was going through my archives and looking for something that I could present, and I was listening to Beethoven, I was like, yes, but no. It is extremely difficult, but also it gives you this surface, where you can project everything what a human being more or less can express. That is what great art is, I think. And I remember going after the concert. It was a great performance. The orchestra played it very well. It is extremely hard. All the symphonies are extremely hard. There are excerpts for all the instrumentalists. There are things that have been considered unplayable during Beethoven's times. And I think one thing is because Beethoven was an idealist, not only in a philosophical and way for humanity, but also in the music itself. The technical aspects, the difficulties result from having an idea that is not necessarily instrumentalistic.
Erina, can we take some questions? Sorry to interrupt you. Is that okay? We have Matthew Leo who has a question. Please, Matthew.
Hi there. I was wondering, it's common question, the relationship between a conductor, any performing artist, and the composer they're playing. What their quote unquote responsibility would be to that composer in regards to trying to play exactly what's on the page or doing it in a way that you think the composer would have approved of. And I'm just curious what all of your takes are on that specifically, and if it's different because of just the monolith that Beethoven is, and like how far you can stray without, showing him quote disrespect, or if that's even possible.
For me as conductor, I try to be as I think we all should try to be as faithful to the score as possible. Obviously, there is more than the notes, and it is more than the numbers. True to the score doesn't mean literally. True to the score means the spirit. And to read that between the notes, so the interpretation is more what is between the notes, right? The intention, the idea. I think that is the difficulty, and that also can change. Taste does change over time, as we know from great recordings. There are many ways to do a Beethoven Fifth Symphony in an extraordinary, truthful, faithful way, I believe, and that is what makes music great. But Lydia was
Great.
not agreeing, I saw.
Thank you. So I just want to read, we should probably move on to Michael, but before that, I'll just read a few questions. Keep asking everyone, it's great. We got so many, I'm sorry I couldn't unmute all of you since we have to move through it. But from Alta Price asked, I'd be curious to know what each presenter feels is Beethoven's most underappreciated work, Danke. And then we have a question from Maya. Should we postpone the 250th anniversary to 2021? Does Ludwig need an anniversary program at all? So just two questions to keep in mind. Maybe we can segue to you, Michael, if you want to answer one of them, or just get going right to your presentation.
Right, thank you. Well, about the proximity issue, and I guess this answers the question a little bit, the first question. I'm a sort of a contrarian champion of some of the war horses precisely because they are just too proximate and we're not really paying attention anymore. So I think the finale of the Pathetique Symphony, sorry, that's Tchaikovsky. The finale of the Pathetique Sonata, Opus 13, is really underappreciated. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I apologized in advance for some of the sound quality issues. I'm going to play a little bit here, and just to introduce the discussion of the finale of Opus 13, I want to say that for composers, every mentor, every composer I've ever worked with and loved focuses on moments. It's moments that matter. We can't think about Beethoven as a whole or as a philosophical construct. All we care about is what happens. And so we're going to focus on moments today. And in fact, one of the things that I like to do, my students, hi Matt, thanks for your question. One of the things I love to do is to create a narrative. I'm not talking about programmatic music like the bird calls in the Pastoral Symphony or the Egmont, but I'm talking about intrinsic to the music, to the structure. There are things that happen that have a story, that you can tell the story. In this case, it's the pitch A flat. I'm not kidding. It's the A flat of this movement. I want everyone to sing that pitch, please, in your own chosen octave. Are you ready? Go. La. Thank you. And it is the syllable la. How do you like that? Actually, I guess according to strict solfege, it's la, because it's an A flat, but we'll call it la. So I just want you to listen to the opening melody. And then there it is at the very peak of that melody. And he even emphasizes it with the grace notes. He emphasizes it with, and then the A flat can happen anywhere in the piece. He emphasizes it in the bass as well. Listen. There it is. The A flat is the hero of this movement. And I want to say that when you do something specific like that, focus on a pitch like that, it's not reductive at all. It's not reductive. It actually opens up an entire possibility of ways of understanding everything else that's going on. It's not just moments, but it's the interconnections among moments, the structure itself. But the A flat is crucial to Beethoven's imagination here. And there are three ways in which we're going to hear the A flat at least. One of them is this first one, that chord. But then there's this chord. That's called the augmented sixth chord. And in your honor, Dean, it's the German sixth chord. And it's the most dissonant chord in Beethoven's harmonic language. Yes, it is. It's the most dissonant chord. And it's all over this movement, especially with the A flat in the bass, which is here. But then we get this chord as well. Oh! That's called a 4-2 chord, right? This is so nerdy, isn't it? You can't listen to Beethoven without getting nerdy, ultimately, because you have to know what's going on. Let me take that back. You know what's going on, even if you don't have a name for it. Beethoven is so open, so generous, that you don't need a vocabulary for it. I'm just giving you names for things that you already know because he gives them to you so generously. So we have a situation where the A flat evolves in this piece. The power of the A flat changes, its context changes. And so I'll just give you an example. Here's one of my favorite moments. There it is again, A flat. Ready? There's the 5-4-2 again. And how does it resolve? It's a very dissonant chord, not quite as dissonant as the German sixth. Boy, does Beethoven love that chord. Remember this sonata? Does this sound familiar? That's a 5-4-2 as well. Here's this one. But in this case, it resolves to an A flat in the bass. Oh, it resolves. In this case, the A flat is the sweet note, the mollifier. And again, listen. Oh, there's the A flat down below again. And then the most beautiful theme of all. How much time do I have? 4 minutes and 20 seconds, plenty of time. Here is the theme, that the most beautiful, yes, joyful theme, Erina, joyful. Listen to this theme. Guess what the bass note is? A flat chord, French sixth. There it is. There's the A flat chord. There it is. Let's go on. My favorite moment in this whole piece is the second episode of this rondo. A rondo is a piece that keeps coming round back to the opening theme. Here it comes back. You'll recognize this passage. Here's the second statement of the rondo. A flat. What happens next? What? Where did this come from? It's from a different world. It's a completely different character. It's like opera. Yes, he only wrote one opera, but he was writing opera over and over again in his instrumental works. And guess what key this episode is in? I'll give you one guess. It's an A flat major. And it's even more exciting than that, because in this episode in A flat major, I'm not kidding. What Beethoven does is he takes us back to school. Everything that happens in this A flat episode is called species counterpoint, which is the way that 18th century composers learned how to write music. How do you put two voices together? You put them together one-on-one, like this. That's called first species. But then you do them staggered like this. Gene, you remember the number of that one? I won't put you on the spot. That's fourth species. That's fourth species. Hey, how about third species? Are you ready? Later on. That's third species. And he actually has second species too. But my favorite moment in this favorite moment is this. Listen to that melody. That that melody is an audible sign, that's my book title, an audible sign of counterpoint. He loves that melody. Does that sound familiar to you Bach nerds? It's just like the musical offering. He's giving us a shape that absolutely defines contrapuntal composition. And it's an A-flat major, which is the most unstable pitch of C minor, but now he makes it as stable as he possibly can. I've got 1 minute. I've got 1 minute. And I'm gonna play you my favorite passage of all. Sorry, they're all my favorite passages, aren't they? Are you ready? This is that beautiful theme back in C major. C major. Oh, wait, I gotta start at the beginning. It's so sweet. Yes, Erina, it's joyful. No A-flats anywhere in sight. Take it down. And what's below it? A sharp, A sharp. It's the only time in the history of music that you have a doubly diminished octave. A doubly diminished octave. It's the worst moment in music history. It's a crisis. I've got, how much time do I have? 5 seconds. In the coda, what happens? The very last thing we hear is, what key is that? Take a wild guess. It's A-flat major. How am I going to get back to C minor? How about this? German sixth. Yeah! I think I just broke a string.
Bravo.
The point here is that every, oh, my alarm just went off.
It's okay, Michael, take your time. Keep going.
Every piece of music, not just Beethoven. Beethoven is the fulcrum. He's the center of gravity for this idea that there's a story going on, a story that's being told that crystallizes around a single idea, an urmotif, or even just a single pitch. In this case, the A-flat, which takes on so many guises and disguises, very dissonant, but also very sweet. An entire set of species counterpoint as the foundation for A-flat major. And Beethoven gives us an entire reality that we can hear, and he grounds us in that reality. And it's very powerful. And it's the story of my life to tell those stories in my own music. And I learned it from him.
Thank you, Michael. We have a few questions which were asked by Emma Danzak. I've unmuted you, Emma, if you'd like to speak, please.
Oh, do you have a preference for which of these questions
Whatever you'd like to ask.
Okay. Well, I think the one I'm most interested in is, I think a lot about Beethoven, and I guess like Lydia, I'm interested in his centrality. And I think there's something useful in sort of, I think it's helpful to think of classical music as a kind of workable unit. And I think that it can be defined in a sort of useful way by thinking backwards. Like, you know, if we extend back to Handel and Bach and all that, we're very interested in those composers who echo themselves in Beethoven in a very obvious, traceable, juicy way. We're not as interested in the composers before that who we can't trace as easily. And then if we study classical music, we think of these people in the canon, you know, we think Schubert, Brahms, who come right out of Beethoven. And then a little further along, we think of, you know, the second Viennese school and these people, even out to contemporary composers who are influenced by Beethoven. And they're easy to group in the idea of classical music, but those that aren't, those that are doing their own thing, those that are really into, for instance, my friend who really doesn't like Beethoven at all and really likes Dolly Parton a lot, she wouldn't necessarily consider herself part of this lineage. And so I wonder how useful it is to think about Beethoven as being the center of this kind of canonical musical language that we think about when we think about classical music, and what the utility would be of defining that kind of canon, which we relate to in this sort of you know, sort of present but also historical way.
Who wants to speak? Michael, do you want to answer first before we go to Lydia?
Emma's a dear friend of mine, and you have presented this question to me before, and I'm still delighted by it, intrigued by it, puzzled by it. I know that you're right, that it's the canonical thing. As someone who has benefited from the canon professionally, and you know, all the patriarchal problems that go with canonical thought, I understand the deep problems with the construction of the canon, its exclusionary power, and the way that Beethoven assumes this sort of authority. As I said, as you just heard me go a little bit crazy over this music, I can't help feeling that whatever we want to call canonical in Beethoven's music is absolutely warranted. I don't understand the problem for me. It's not just a construct in my own mind and in my own life. It's real. Everything that's happening in these works, hundreds of works, is something so profound and so beautiful, so joyful and so painful that I can't live without it. And that's my problem. And so from the very beginning, in that room in my cousin's house, listening to Yehudi Menuhin, I never thought about it in terms of canonical. And I know I'm not answering your question because I don't think of it that way. And that's my privilege. And I'm sorry.
Thank you, Michael. I think this is a good time maybe to segue to Lydia. And we have the philosopher who comes after the fact and synthesizes us. So go ahead, Lydia.
Well, there's not a lot of time left, but
Take your time. We'll extend it for you. No time pressure at all. So,
just on the point of detail, I think one way in which we address the question of how to perform Beethoven today, or any canonic work with which we're very familiar, is precisely by doing as Michael did, which is to pick up on a detail and give that detail a new kind of emphasis and sort of read the whole in terms of a tiny detail, in the way that I kind of read the entirety of music history by this one reference to Beethoven's Fifth. And that you could, I remember in my PhD exam at Cambridge, I kept getting the question, why not Wagner? Why not Wagner? Why do you focus on Beethoven? I said, okay, next book I'll write on Wagner, and then, you know, I'll change my story. And so, which I did, in fact. So I think the detail that one picks up on in an interpretation becomes crucial. On this point, my father told me yesterday when I was talking to him about Beethoven, he said he wanted to show off at his inaugural lecture for Cambridge and decided to give a lecture on Beethoven and was arguing, as Michael has, for the importance of tiny details, sat down at the piano and played a sonata movement in major rather than minor. And he'd never noticed. So, you know, details. Sometimes I gave a lecture once on Wagner and accidentally played a clip from Richard Strauss. So I too have made mistakes. Another point about detail. I slightly resist the idea that we heard about of prioritizing sort of Beethoven, Schoenberg, Stravinsky, and so on as producing revolutionary works where we listen to these works and we say, where did they come from? Oh, it's God inspired. God came down that day and there it was, this new thing we've never heard before. Because precisely this is the same we do in philosophy with Kant or Hegel or etc. You know, oh, this philosopher came from nowhere, this pure genius. This all has to be debunked precisely by the details that if you look at the material of the compositions and you look at the composers around Beethoven and composers to whom Beethoven is responding, he picks up sort of elements of Bach or Mozart or Haydn and many, many more of the names we don't know, so to speak, then you see that it's not so much that the material comes from nowhere, but rather he's repatterned it repatterned it to do something. He's produced a new mosaic or new pattern with the material that they all also had and were working with. And so the revolution, I would say, to pick up on both of you, is in the detail. It's in the small detail of doing something with the detail that wasn't done. You know, we say Wagner. I mean, Wagner's operas are full of borrowings from the people he claimed to hate. And yet, he picks up on certain details and does things and does something, and you say, my God, I've never heard this before. But of course, you have heard it before. And so I think both for the question about interpretation and the question about assessing newness and noticing things we haven't noticed before, it all turns on this issue of detail. And the detail is entirely within the material. And so even though I do a lot of social history and I'm a so-called critical theorist, and I'm looking at the broad ideological appropriations and misuse of Beethoven and so on, I think again, what counts is what you find actually in the material of the compositions and so on. So even though I am known to have debunked the work concept, that doesn't mean I debunked musical composition or the importance of these details. And I believe this as much in music as in philosophy. These are parallel enterprises for me. So hooray for details.
And can I add something to that? Because I find it very interesting. Absolutely agree. Of course, I mean, when we study the score, it is kind of, sometimes we have, as an interpreter, we have to take care that we don't demystify in the way that we take out the what is special about a piece. Yes, analysis and understanding the work is absolutely the base of interpretation. But on top of that, interpretation is to bring out what made it special in a way. Maybe
the point is that that can change. New details can appear. I once, for example, did an experiment in Germany in front of a German audience, actually in Frankfurt for Adorno's 100th birthday, where I rewrote a chapter of Goethe, which is an extremely pretentious thing to do. But I took all these words and rearranged them. And the Goethe professors were up in arms. They said, we recognized it, but it wasn't good. Was it Goethe? Was it not? And I said, precisely. And because I'd picked out a concept, the notion of Bewegung, actually, of the idea of movement, and tried to show its centrality in a chapter in Goethe, which people had overlooked, that if you looked at it, and it's precisely by you playing your A flat all the time. It was picking out a word that nobody had noticed. So each person to his own or her own detail, because it's not that one detail is going to give you the explanation for what makes it work. Rather, the newness of the interpretation is like Serkin's great interpretations. He picks out a sort of rhythmic dissonance in his piano performance that actually he's just died. So, but he picks out something dissonant in the performance where you say, my God, I've never heard that. It sounds, post-Schönbergian, and he's playing Bach. And that's really incredible. So it's not about the standardization of interpretation as always trying to get what was original, but in a way, recomposing it in the light of a detail. And like Michael, your performance on A flat is extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you. Dean, are you there?
I'm there. Can I read some questions?
I would answer a question if there was one. I just wanted to say one other thing about Beethoven, is that in the period around Beethoven, which is really interesting, it's that there's a new cult or a new convention or a new culture of the way we listen to music as being without words, as being without sort of a program. So even though he's famous for these sort of programmatic eroica and this debate between the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies and so on, it's the way in which we come to learn. As you said, he's producing an opera but in symphonic form. This is precisely what Wagner so admired in Beethoven. He just thought he'd bring back the word on the instruction of the Ninth Symphony. But there is an opera going on. There's a narrative, there's a drama, but it's worked out through musical form. And so he invests musical form with something that composers prior didn't have so much opportunity to do in this sort of so-called purely instrumental way. And that rather depends on the opening up of concert halls and a new convention of the concert and so on. And I think that's important too, because it gives us a new way of listening. And that way of listening is extremely difficult. It's as hard as reading a philosophical text, and that's hard enough. And one's watching an idea unfold in a language that's really difficult, but it's like watching the unfolding of a logical proof or a mathematical formula, and there's something incredible about that too. It's a difficult thing to learn how to do. I know, because I'm trying to play and I can't do it. Questions, Dean, from anyone?
Yes, I can read some. From Donald Sloan. This says, for my friend Michael, it seems that Beethoven had two kinds of works, great pieces and transcendently great pieces. Is it the number of those moments, the way a moment is redefined throughout a piece? What do you think?
He had some pretty bad pieces too.
Wellington's Victory.
Yeah. Another dear friend, Donald Sloan, is a fine composer, wonderful professor. Hi, Don. I don't know. You know me well enough to know that I always love the one I'm with when it comes to Beethoven. I know what you mean about the transcendent ones, but for me, the bagatelles, the late bagatelles, are just the tiny little pieces are transcendent, and they're only 30 seconds, 40 seconds long. So I hope this will speak to your question. I for the fun of it, and since it's the Goethe-Institut, I did a little translation of my own of Egmont's final speech. And I just want to read a couple of sentences. It'll be very quick, I promise, Dean.
Take your time, don't worry.
Egmont has fallen asleep the hour before his execution. He was the leader of the rebellion. And he's about to die. And he wakes up and he says, "You beautiful vision, the light of day has scared you away. Yes, they were revealed to me. They were revealed to my sight, the two sweetest joys of my heart. Divine liberty took the shape of my beloved Clara. And the lovely woman was arrayed herself like the goddess. In a solemn moment, they appeared united with aspect more serious than tender." And it goes on about this amazing vision, this uncanny communion between the goddess of liberty and his girlfriend, Clara. I would like to say that right there you have, I would call it a wedding between the great and the transcendent. What Goethe is doing there is he's giving us a final vision of a woman, a beloved person, a human being, absolutely coincident with the divine. The ideal is realized, embodied. And for Egmont, at the very end, they are together as one figure and giving him the courage he needs in his final moments. And so I make no distinction between the human and the transcendent, because Goethe doesn't, and I don't think Beethoven does either.
Great. We have one last live question from Lucy Turner, who is a PhD student in historical musicology at Columbia. You're unmuted, Lucy. Go ahead.
Yes, hello, all.
Hi.
Wonderful discussion here today. My question is that it seems that in many discussions of Beethoven, including the one we're having right now, the central argument for his greatness hinges or revolves around the idea of Beethoven being particularly revolutionary, or the things that are new or different about his music compared to predecessors or contemporaries or even those that come after him. Do you personally, any of you, think that this is in fact the source of what is so compelling about his music for many, or does that compellingness lie elsewhere?
I think some people would, if the focus of your question, Lucy, is on whether we like it because it's new, the contrary answer would be that many people like it because it endures, so that it's not just its newness, but that it seems to speak over and over again, to, generation after generation after generation. And accounting for that endurance over time, it would be a slightly different kind of question. It brings us to the question of sometimes one could say the appropriation of Beethoven, that people will use it for every kind of occasion, not yet a wedding ceremony, but as far as I know, but maybe even, they'll use it for every kind of occasion and invest what they want to hear in it. But in part, there has to be something there into which one invests all this desire and need. So that would just be a different approach to the question. Questions of newness and endurance are, I don't know, they're too inflated for me. I don't, I think it all needs debunking, but I think that's a different approach to the question that you're asking.
Well, this was a real pleasure. Thank you to the three of you. Thank you very much to all of you out there watching for your interesting questions. Hope you stay healthy and safe during these times. And there's much more to come from us. In 2 weeks, we have an episode on translating cultural identity and translation. So stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dean.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.